All right, let's look at the content video for our last study in Genesis for the season. We are looking at Genesis 30 verses 25 to Genesis 31, um, the end of the chapter, which is verse 55. So this can be broken down into three sections. The first section is Jacob acquiring wealth. The second is Jacob fleeing Laban, and finally, Laban confronting and ultimately blessing Jacob. So the first section is 25 to 43. Um, it begins with a mention of Joseph having been born. So that marks the end of that kind of story. And then it moves directly into Jacob wanting to leave and go back to his home, back to the promised land. Laban knows that he has been blessed because of Jacob, and so urges Jacob to stay on longer. In return, he will pay him in streaked and spotted goats as well as dark sheep. So this would make it very easy for them to know whose sheep were whose. So Laban's sons take all the speckled and striped goats and the dark sheep away from the current flock so that moving forward, Jacob would get all the colored animals. There is some lack of clarity as to what is exactly being said here, but needless to say, the main point is that Jacob um, is, first of all, trying to find a way to ensure that there's no stealing going on. But then we see that Jacob is going to use trickery in his own mind to increase the size of his flocks. So when he sees the strong animals becoming ready to mate, he puts them in front of the water troughs that he's put strips of white in. So Jacob is thinking, oh, when these sheep or goats see the white and the dark, they're going to conceive young ones that are speckled or dark. And so that appears to be what's being said. Later on, we learn that uh, Laban changes the wages back and forth. And so it could be described that when he made the weak animals face the speckled and dark animals, uh, maybe that was when his wages were white animals. I don't know the answer, but ultimately, Jacob is trying to use trickery to increase the size of his flock. That's the point. Um, the questions about what exactly is going on here are not 100% clear. There are some who would suggest that Jacob was actually setting up phalluses for the animals so that encouraged them to mate better. But at the end of the day, he was trying to trick Laban, and we are told the result is that Jacob grew exceedingly prosperous in the same way, and using the same words that had been used of Abraham earlier. Um, he grew exceedingly prosperous. And while it appears that it was Jacob's scheming that made him rich, we will see later in this account that it was, in fact, God who blessed him. This brings us to the next section. Now, as a result of all this going on, Laban's sons were angry at Jacob because they saw him as doing what? Stealing their inheritance. Does that sound familiar? Well, he also noticed that Laban had kind of changed his attitude towards him. And so he was starting to get nervous. And if that wasn't enough, God told him that it was time to return to the promised land. So that was like a word of confirmation from God. So he speaks to his Laban's daughters, which were his wives, and tells them the story and um, reminds them that their dad had tried to cheat him out of um, blessing, and yet God had blessed him in spite of all that. And we also learned that Jacob had a dream where God showed Jacob that he had seen Laban's abuse of him and was going to bless him in spite of this. So they agree with Jacob that it was time to leave. The way they see it, their dad had sold them. And so uh, they agreed to leave. Unbeknownst to Jacob, Rachel steals her father's idols, and Jacob um, is once again said to have deceived somebody. This time it's Laban, by not telling him that they're leaving. So they leave, and it takes Laban a whole 3 days to figure out what's going on. And once he figures out what's going on, he pursues Jacob, and it takes him 7 days to catch up to him. He is probably angry and thinking about doing harm to Jacob, but just before he catches up to him, he has a dream, and God tells Laban not to say anything good or bad about Jacob. In other words, God is saying, I am with Jacob, watch yourself. So when Laban confronts Jacob the next day, he makes this clear by saying to him, I have the power to harm you. And it's only because of this dream that I'm protecting you. He said it wasn't fair that you went away so we couldn't have this party, but it's hard to imagine that the initial anger at Jacob was simply that he did not give him a chance to say goodbye, nor if God hadn't intervened and warned him not to do any harm to Jacob and his family, if he wouldn't have done harm to Jacob. But Laban does, however, challenge Jacob over the missing idols. Jacob replies that while he left because he was afraid of Laban and that Laban may take his family by force, he did not steal anything from Laban. Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the idols because he said that if anyone had stolen them, they would be put to death. Rachel thinks in the saddle rather than thinking on her feet because she wasn't on her feet, and avoids being exposed as a thief by claiming that it was her time of the month. Meanwhile, Jacob turns it around on Laban and says, you know, he was not the one that was a thief, but rather it was Laban who had mistreated him. He had made him work for 14 years for his wives and then another 6 years for his flocks, but kept changing the rules. Then he states the most important point of this whole account, and that's this: that if the God of my father had not been with me, you would have sent me away empty-handed. So here we see that Jacob is leaving all of his deceptions behind and understanding that it was not a result of Laban's mistreating him or Jacob's schemes that Jacob now prospered, but that it had been God all along who had blessed him. Even after this, Laban is still trying to lay claim to Jacob's family, but acknowledges there is nothing he can do about the situation, and so makes a covenant with Jacob. In the end, just as it happened earlier with his father and Abimelech, Laban blesses them on their way, and he kisses his daughters and grandchildren. This ends this section with Laban, and he's going to go out of the fire and into the frying pan because the next man he's going to have to face is his brother Esau. But that's for another day.